Selamat datang di interview session Amar Bank. Bersama saya Audrey, kali ini kita akan membahas topik yang sedang hangat di industri perbankan, yaitu krisis bank-bank besar di dunia. Belakangan ini dunia sedang banyak diterpa masalah, mulai dari COVID-19, perang Ukraina, guncangan inflasi, sampai krisis perbankan dunia yang disebabkan oleh kenaikan suku bunga bank sentral. Tapi sebenarnya apa sih yang menyebabkan hal ini bisa terjadi? Beberapa alasan mengapa tiba-tiba bank-bank besar di dunia bisa krisis dan ambruk. Yang pertama, Fed yang menaikkan suku bunga. Lalu, bank tersebut terlalu fokus pada industri tertentu seperti cryptocurrency, startup companies, dan atau pada perusahaan teknologi. Yang ketiga, aset dan liability yang mismatch di mana menyebabkan likuiditas bank tersebut terganggu. Dan yang terakhir, bank run atau penarikan dana nasabah secara massal dari suatu bank. Nah, sekarang bersama kita sudah ada CEO dari Amar Bank, yaitu Pak Vishal Tulsian, yang akan membahas hal-hal tersebut. Okay, how are you, sir?
I'm good, very good. How are you?
I'm good, sir. It's been a long time, sir, since our last interview and on talk show. Okay. So we're back in action. And so we've been talking about the major banks' failure in global. What do you think about that, sir?
In a very simple term, just to explain to your viewers and listeners, a bank business model is that they would borrow money or get the deposits from the individuals, and then they would put it for the lending, for loans, and some part of the money they would put in the treasury assets.
Okay.
So that is required as a statutory reserve or for some market securities, but that is a small percentage. Now that's the usual business model. Now in case of the Western world and US, as we know that their interest rate of central bank has been 0%, and also in some instances negative rates. What that did was that the banks were able to borrow at a very cheap rate. So when they got the deposits also, those were also at a very cheap rates. So it's like you can imagine that the cost of your raw material for a manufacturing company and that the cost of the funds for a bank are their raw materials was very low.
Okay.
And then they would lend. Now, so obviously the lending also is not going to be at a very high interest rate.
Yeah.
But since Silicon Valley Bank received a huge amount of deposits, they did not had that much of lending market. So instead of that, they went ahead and purchased a lot of bonds, which were very safe bonds, not a risky bonds. And the bonds prices move in this way. They are government bonds and the corporate AAA rated bonds. But the bonds prices are inversely related to the interest rate.
Okay.
Which means if the interest rate is low, the prices are high. If the interest rate goes up, prices go down.
Okay.
So at that time it was 0% interest rate. So the bond prices were high. Whatever the prices were, they bought at that rate.
Okay.
And they were able to service the bank. They were having very comfortable profits and all also. But in the last 1 year, as we saw, that the interest rates started going up. And that has been the cause of the problem for them. When the interest rate went up significantly, bond prices came down. When the bond prices came down, technically there is no problem for them because a bond has a maturity.
Okay.
So say government has issued a bond which will mature in 2035.
Okay.
Which means at in the year 2035 they will get their money back. And they were ready to hold it until that time. However, the public, some of the startups over there panicked And they thought that if the bond prices are going down, the bank will be in the trouble. Their anticipation was that the bank will get into trouble, and in that anticipation, they started withdrawing their funds, and that's a typical case of a bank run. And so that's what happened. So it's very say unusual kind of situation where bank hasn't done anything which is out of ordinary or a fraud or anything wrong, but in anticipation of the bank going down, bank went down.
Is it actually, if you say it that way, is it actually connecting to the client or the company's trust to the bank, so they will withdraw the money? Is it connected to, sir?
So in this today's age where we are hyper connected, in that case it happens so that one startup, there are venture capital funds. The venture capital fund asks their portfolio companies that whatever funds you have put in this bank, withdraw. Once they say, that news spreads a lot within that circle, and that is what happened. All the companies came to know, and everybody went to the bank to withdraw their funds.
So it's more like a panic.
More like a panic, yes.
Okay.
So in fact, when they started doing that, in the first instance, they were able to sell some of the bonds at loss, and were able to pay back to the depositors. But then the news is spreading more that bank is in trouble, they are selling at loss, and one thing leads to another. So it was more like a public themselves anticipated it and accordingly took some actions, which led to the fall.
I see. Okay. So with that kind of case, is it impossible that will happen too in Indonesia, sir? In banking industry in Indonesia?
So now the bank run, so we have to understand how the banks work throughout the world. Now the way the bank works is that bank would take deposits. It's not going to just put the capital also for themselves, right?
Okay.
So now if the bank takes a capital which is calculated by capital adequacy ratio. So if capital is 1, then the bank is allowed to take 9 deposit.
Okay.
So 10% of, roughly I'm giving you the rough number, usually it is around 8%, but 10% of capital adequacy ratio is allowed. So which means if the bank has 1 equity capital, they can take 9, and accordingly they can have the asset of 9, which means they can have the loan asset of 9 in very simple terms, right? So if you have 1 capital, you can have asset of 9 and you have the deposit. Now when you take the deposits are the savings account have a maturity of 1 month, 2 months, or savings account have no maturity. Whereas when you lend, you're lending for a capital project and you're lending for working capital, they all have a time frame of 12 months, 24 months, 5 years, 10 years. So your deposits are short term and your lending is a long term. So if every depositor asks for the money on day 1, you have to ask from your borrowers, right? Which you cannot take it because you have given for long term.
Okay.
So those kind of mismatches only leads to the bank run. So that's a typical case of a bank run when there is a panic that bank doesn't have enough money. That is why. So it's usually not a problem if there is no fraud in the bank. So suppose that lending is a fraud, or lending has been done to a very bad set of customers. If that's not the case, then there is no problem with the system. That's one. Second, capital adequacy ratio. In Western world, it is because of the low margins, it's very low, much lower than Indonesia.
Okay.
For an example, so lower the capital adequacy ratio, higher the risk.
Okay.
So as per the regulations, if it is allowed 6 to 8%, which is in US, over here also 8 to 10% on an average you would find, but you will find most of the banks maintaining it around 15% and all. So like conservative banks like us, we would maintain even higher at 25-30%, but that's something where you maintain your capital adequacy ratio at a high rate. That's one. Second, macroeconomically, we don't have in Indonesia zero interest policy as it is there in US, and that is the key reason for this problem. We never had this zero interest, so we as a bank would not go out and placing the money in the bonds and all.
Yeah. So most likely that kind of thing won't happen in here, or
Yeah, so we are not, because it's a very different market scenario.
Yeah.
And to give you an example, in Indonesian context, there couldn't have been anything worse than COVID. Yeah. So
Okay.
if a banking sector has passed through that very well, then it's a proof is in the pudding that it is a proof that the banking sector is very resilient. In fact, Indonesia banking sector is even more resilient in many other countries in Southeast Asia. That overall capital of the banking sector during these last 3 years have only increased. So overall capital employed in the banking sector has increased since the COVID. So that just shows that the attraction of the economy and the strength of the economy is very high.
I see. Okay. So since the COVID-19 is already, I don't want to say this,
Yes.
but we are praying the same
Yeah.
thing, that this will already going into a positive movement, right, sir,
Right.
to COVID. So most likely we are going to face an increment also in the banking industry in Indonesia, right, sir? The conditions.
Yes, correct. Yeah. So banking sector is very much linked to the economy, and as we can see that the consumer confidence index in the economy is one of the best indicators of any economy, which is improving quite a bit. So that definitely gives a lot of optimism towards the economy going forward.
So in conclusion, can I say that we don't have to worry much about the condition in the major banks in the Western? So because some people are still kind of like, I don't know, it's worried like it will happen in Indonesia, but since we have a different kind of market and different kind of strategies in Indonesia and the Western, so it won't affect that much, right, sir?
Correct. Those kind of things definitely we are not connected with.
Yeah.
And I think, as we have seen in case of Silicon Valley, panic is the worst enemy. Yeah. So that's one which every individual should avoid is panic. And today's social market, we receive a lot of right news, wrong news, fake news, and all. And that is the one challenge which every individual has, that not to consume these panic-driven news. And I think regulators over here are doing a great job, and they should be the right source. So anytime if anybody faces any sort of question that whether this bank has any problem or not, I think they should directly approach OJK and ask them, and they would get the answer.
I think that answered all my questions, sir, about this situation. Thank you so much, Mr. Vishal.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Dengan ini berakhir sudah interview session Amar Bank bersama Mr. Vishal Tulsian. Jika kamu memiliki pertanyaan atau komentar, silahkan berikan di kolom komentar di bawah ini. Sampai jumpa di interview session Amar Bank berikutnya.